In a land where the wind never seemed to rest and loneliness clung to old wooden porches like dust, folks learned to see each other through what was missing: a lost limb, a faded youth, a past too heavy to name. And into that world stepped a woman with scars she never asked for, stepping off a weather-worn train as a mail-order bride. But instead of a warm welcome, she met only stares that slid away and whispers that stung worse than winter wind. Who would marry a woman whose face bore the story of a tragedy? Yet she didn't leave. Though her heart ached in the silence of rejection, she brewed tea for neighbor children, mended clothes for an old widow, and kept smiling even when no one smiled back. Until one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the dust in gold, a man walked into town. He held a cane in his hand, and his eyes didn't open. He couldn't see the world around him, but he was the first one who truly saw her. In a place where appearances measured worth, how was it that a blind cowboy became the only soul who saw her beauty clear as day? And why did she stay when she'd once been so used to running from a town that now held just one man who didn't look but understood? This is where the story begins, where scars became a map to something tender, and love somehow didn't begin with a glance, but with the willingness to wait. There were 3 mirrors in the boarding house hallway, but Clara Porter hadn't looked into any of them in years. She'd learned that glances turned to winces, that kindness vanished when her bonnet slipped back, or her scarf sagged down her neck, revealing the pale swath of burn scars that trailed from her left cheek to her collarbone like a map drawn in sorrow. They whispered she'd once been beautiful, that some fire had taken that away. But Clara knew what really burned was not her skin, but the way people's eyes changed when they saw her. She was 49, a seamstress, a quiet soul, a woman who loved children but never had her own. She still wrote poetry, though she never signed her name. And every week for the past 6 months, she'd stop by the depot to inquire about the train west, always with a letter in hand, always torn up before she left. It wasn't until she saw the ad. Widowed rancher, Wyoming territory. Seeks mail-order bride. Sight impaired in war. Desires companionship, warmth, and a good listener. No photos needed. She read it twice, then once more. Could someone really want what he couldn't see? That night, Clara finally wrote a letter she didn't tear apart. She didn't tell him about the scars. But she did mention lilacs. She wrote of music boxes in winters by the fire, and she sent it with a silent prayer, not for romance, but for kindness. Weeks later, a reply came. Your words felt like sunlight. I may not see your face, but I hope I'll know your heart. Come if you're willing. My ranch is called Hope Hollow. James called her. And so with trembling hands and an old leather suitcase, Clara Porter boarded the train that would change everything. Hope Hollow wasn't much to look at. The train dropped Clara off at a platform that felt more like a memory than a destination. A slanted wooden bench, a water barrel with ice crusted at the rim, and a mare tied up beneath a wind-worn pine. There was no one else. Just a man in a hat pulled low over his brow, holding a cane, and leaning gently toward her voice as she introduced herself. Clara Porter, she said, smoothing her gloves. You must be Mr. Calder. He smiled. Not broadly, but gently, the kind of smile that didn't aim for the eyes, but came from somewhere further down deeper. James, he replied. Just James, if that's all right. He didn't ask to see her face. Didn't fumble awkwardly. His hand found hers in a firm but warm shake. Then he offered her his arm, not like a man escorting a lady, but like someone saying this is safe. I am safe. They rode home in silence, mostly the buggy creaking, the wheels cracking the frost along the path. Clara watched the trees pass their branches like arms raised in winter prayer. She felt him beside her, quiet, steady. Do you miss seeing? She asked before she could stop herself. He thought a moment. Sometimes, he admitted, but not in the way folks imagine. I miss colors more than faces, and I miss the sky before a storm. There was a pause. I never liked mirrors, Clara whispered. James turned his face toward her, though his gaze didn't find her eyes. Then we'll keep none in the house. No surprise, no pity, just simple acceptance. When they reached the ranch, a low log house wrapped in prairie light, Clara stepped down first. She hadn't realized until then how tightly she'd been holding herself together. But here in the middle of nowhere, a man who couldn't see her had made her feel more seen than anyone ever had. And for the first time in years, she didn't reach for her scarf. But even in a quiet house without mirrors, some truths can't stay hidden forever. And Clara's past was catching up with her, one letter at a time. It started with the postman's bootsteps on the gravel road. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, a thin stack of papers wrapped in twine landed at the foot of the porch. Most were for James' feed schedules, Braille newspapers, a hand-delivered sermon from the circuit preacher who came through once a month. But one letter came addressed to Mrs. Clara Porter Calder. Neat script, Eastern ink, the kind of handwriting trained in finishing schools and judgmental parlors. Clara didn't open it. Not that day, not the next. It sat on the mantel while she cooked washed, fed chickens and mended shirts. She glanced at it sometimes, but it stared back like a wound that refused to close. One evening, James ran his fingers along the envelope and said gently, "That letter doesn't scare me, Clara. But if it scares you, then I'll throw it in the fire right now." She shook her head. "I'll read it. When I'm ready." He nodded once, and that was enough. 3 nights later, with stew cooling in their bowls and the fire crackling low, she opened the letter. The words cut like dry paper. "You were never meant for a husband. We were wrong to hope. Your face brings shame. Do not contact us again." There was no signature, but she didn't need one. James heard the way her breath caught. He stood slowly, making his way toward her. "Was it them?" he asked. She nodded. He waited. "James?" Her voice trembled. "They said I wasn't meant for a husband." He didn't say anything at first. He simply took her hand and placed it against his chest where the beat was quiet but steady. "Then they've never known a man with eyes in his heart," he whispered. That night, Clara didn't cry. Not because she wasn't hurt, but because something inside her refused to break anymore. She stood taller the next morning, stirred the oats with sure hands, and when she washed the breakfast dishes, she caught her reflection in the windowpane. Not pretty, not young, but whole. But the past isn't the only ghost that visits uninvited. When a stranger rides in asking for James and calling him by a name, Clara's never heard the quiet life begins to tremble at the edges. It was the kind of morning that smelled of wet earth and pine sap, the chill clinging to Clara's shawl as she stepped out to gather eggs. She was halfway to the coop when she spotted him, a rider, alone, dusty, slouched in the saddle like a man not sure whether he belonged to the living or the dead. James was already on the porch. His hand rested on the wood railing, still and steady, but Clara saw the way his jaw tensed. The man dismounted slowly. His boots sank into the wet ground. Then he spoke. "James Calder," he said. "Or should I say, Corporal Calder?" Clara froze. James didn't answer right away. He tilted his head, measuring the voice. "It's been 20 years since anyone called me that," he said, voice low and flat. Clara stepped forward. "Who is he, James?" The stranger looked at her, then at James. "Your wife." James gave a tight nod. The man chuckled bitterly. "Didn't think you'd ever settle down? Not after what happened at Stone Creek." Clara looked between them. "What happened at Stone Creek?" James turned to her, his voice soft. "A choice I made that left good men behind." The stranger's name was Eli Marks. He'd once served beside James in the cavalry, back when James still had sight and ghosts. Eli wasn't here for revenge, not exactly, but he wasn't here for peace either. "I'm dying, James," he said simply. "Got maybe a month. But I wanted to see the man who walked away before I couldn't anymore." They talked long into the night, not with firelight and whiskey, but with silence between words. Clara sat nearby listening, watching. When Eli turned to her, he said, "You know you married a man who left his whole past behind, don't you?" She nodded. "He didn't leave it behind," she said quietly. "He carried it every day. He just chose not to make it my burden." Later, after Eli left, James sat beside her on the porch. He was quiet, fingers laced with hers. "You know the worst thing," he said. "I wasn't scared of Eli showing up. I was scared of what you'd think once you knew who I'd been." Clara looked at him, voice steady. "You're the only man who's ever seen me. I won't stop seeing you just because you've lived things you regret." James said nothing more that night, but Clara felt the shift like two souls long alone beginning to walk in step. But just as old wounds begin to close, new troubles arrive on horseback, And this time, they come for Clara. Trouble didn't always ride in loud and reckless. Sometimes it arrived quietly like a storm biding its time behind the mountains. It was Clara who first noticed the man. He showed up at the general store in town. Didn't buy much, didn't say much, just stood too long near the flour sacks, watching her. She thought nothing of it at first, but when she returned to the wagon, she found a folded scrap of paper tucked beneath the seat. It read only 3 words, "You owe me." Clara's heart sank. That handwriting. She'd seen it before. Years ago. When she was still Annabelle's prisoner in her own life, forced into a marriage to settle her stepfather's debt. A marriage she escaped not without bruises, and a name she never expected to hear again, Roy Tanner's. She hadn't spoken of him to James. Not yet. She'd carried that shame in silence, much like the scar on her shoulder, the one Roy gave her the night she ran. That evening, Clara sat beside James, knitting by firelight, his hand resting lightly atop hers. She could feel the peace she'd built with him, layer by layer, day by quiet day. But it shook now, threatened by shadows of a past that refused to stay buried. "I think someone from before found me," she whispered. James turned his head, brow furrowing. "Before what?" She took a breath. "Before I had a name I could live with. Before I was free." James didn't ask more. Not yet. Instead, he reached for her hand and held it. "Whatever's out there," he said gently, "you're not facing it alone." Clara nodded, but that night's sleep evaded her. The wind scraped the cabin walls like fingernails on old wood, and somewhere in the darkness she swore she heard a horse's hooves pacing slow and steady just beyond the trees. As the past tightens its grip, Clara must choose reveal everything, and risk losing James, or stay silent, and risk it all. James had seen violence in his time, his war-torn youth, a brother buried too young, the cattle raids that marked the frontier. But nothing had prepared him for the look in Clara's eyes that morning when she stood in the doorway holding a letter and shaking hands. It wasn't long, just a few lines scrawled in familiar ink. "You think a blind man can protect you? He can't even see what you are. Come home, Clara, or I'll bring the past to your doorstep." James didn't ask who wrote it. He only stepped forward and wrapped her in his arms, holding her close enough that her trembling finally quieted. But she knew she couldn't keep hiding. That night, under the low hum of crickets and the distant howl of coyotes, Clara told him everything. About the marriage she never wanted. The man who branded her for defiance. The price she paid for freedom, not just in miles crossed, but in pieces of herself left behind. And James, he didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached out, gently tugged back the fabric of her sleeve, and ran his fingers along the scar she always kept hidden. "Clara," he said finally, voice low and warm, "that scar doesn't change who you are. It just shows what you survived." Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain, but from being seen, truly seen, and still loved. But peace was short-lived. The next morning, the barn was found wide open, horses gone. On the gate, carved with a hunting knife, "I'm closer than you think." James tightened his grip on the rifle that hadn't left the cabin wall in years, and Clara, standing behind him, knew it was time. She wouldn't run again. The past has caught up, and this time Clara must face it with the strength she never knew she had. And the man who finally believes in her. The storm broke not with thunder, but with silence. Clara stood on the porch with James, his hand resting gently on hers as they listened. Every breath of wind, every creak of the barn doors, every bird that paused its call in the trees, it all rang louder in the stillness of their waiting. She could feel the fear in her bones, but deeper still, she felt something else rising, resolve. Not anger, not vengeance, but a quiet defiance born of all the times she'd been told she wasn't enough. "You don't have to protect me," she whispered. "I know," James said, turning his face toward her, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "But I want to." When the man came riding in, the one who'd once owned her, with rings and bruises and threats, he found something he didn't expect. Not a cowering woman in a stranger's arms, not a runaway waiting to be punished, but a woman standing tall with her shoulders straight and her past in the open beside a man who had never even seen her face yet, saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. James stepped down from the porch with steady feet, his rifle cradled loosely in his arms. The man dismounted, sneering. "So this is where you've been hiding." "I haven't been hiding," Clara said, stepping forward before James could speak. "I've been healing. There was no fight. just a reckoning. A conversation held in stares and silences until the man knew he had no more power here and rode off, swallowed by the trees like a bad dream, losing shape in daylight. Later that night, rain came softly to the valley. Clara stood in the doorway, feeling it on her skin, no longer flinching from the wind. James called her in gently. She walked to him barefoot on old wood and knelt beside the man who had shown her the kind of love that needed no eyes to see. And when he reached out and touched her cheek, she smiled, not because she had to, but because for the first time she wanted to. Sometimes life has a gentle way of reminding us the things we once thought made us unlovable may in fact be the very things that lead us home. She was once shunned for the scars she couldn't hide, turned away, laughed at, quietly judged before anyone ever truly spoke to her. And yet she stayed kind. She stayed whole. And in time, a man who had lost his sight gave her something far deeper, the gift of being seen for who she was, not what she looked like. Their story may be set in the dust and silence of the Old West, but its truth still echoes today. That love doesn't always arrive in the way we expect, but when it does, it often begins with tenderness, patience, and the courage to wait. If this story moves something in you, friend, we invite you to be part of our little storytelling circle. Subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, share this video with someone who might need it today, and leave us a comment. Would you like to hear more stories like this, or see what happened after? We believe everyone deserves to be seen, and every love story, especially the quiet ones, deserves to be told. You're not alone out here. Let's keep writing together. Would you like to see what comes next?